Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Methacton High School's Human Anatomy and Physiology class. This is Mr. Adolph, and we are going to do a quick review of the brain, the human brain. I got through about 70% of what I had to cover, so this is a quick review video of the content that I did cover before we so abruptly left school. And then I'm going to have one more clip after this of new information, and then we will be done with this unit. So let's get started. So as you can see here, this is an image of the human brain, and the human brain is arguably the most interesting part of the human body because we know so little about it, and it seems to be capable of way more than we'll ever really fully understand. But we'll do our best, right? So let's get rolling here. So the human brain really can be broken into five distinct areas, known as the cerebrum, which is this large portion here, top, and then we have our basal ganglia and diencephalon, which are going to be in the central area right here. We have our brainstem right here, and then we have our cerebellum back here. Now, as I talked about before, you can think of the brain as being built in complexity from the smallest, most basic version down at the brainstem and cerebellum, which we call the reptile brain, up into the animal brain, which is going to be your diencephalon, and that is going to be where our emotional center is. And then finally, we have our cerebrum, which is the most complex and developed in humans, and that is going to be the portion of our brain which is often referred to as the human brain because this is the part that really separates us from other mammals. Our cerebrum, and specifically our frontal lobe, is extremely well developed compared to other mammals. So let's go. This is just a quick comparison between the human brain and some other large mammals, and you can see while it's similar, it's not similar in size, it's not similar in number of neurons. So we are very, very complex compared to these other animals. Okay, so just as a quick review of some of these structures, our cerebrum is going to be the portion of our brain which is the most superior part of our brain. If you're talking top down, it's going to be up top, and it's broken into two hemispheres, a right and left hemisphere. And those two sides are connected by a mass of neurons called the corpus callosum. And those cross over from the right and left hemispheres and allows our two hemispheres to communicate with each other. We also have our convolutions, which are the grooves and the ridges, the gyri, which are the ridges, and the sulci, which are the grooves. That allows us to increase the amount of surface area of our brain. So by having all these folds, that allows the brain to fit more mass in a smaller area. There is a condition we'll talk about a little later on called lissencephaly, in which a child is born with what would be considered a smooth brain, less convolutions or little to no convolutions, and they are very, very developmentally affected by that. And then fissures are going to be the deep groove. So the first one is this one here, which is the longitudinal fissure, and that separates the right and left hemispheres of the brain. And then we have the transverse fissure, which is going to be this one right here. That's where you're going to have your tentorium cerebelli separating the cerebrum from the cerebellum. That's going to be this groove right here. The cerebral cortex, you can see much better on this next image. The cerebral cortex is this layer of gray matter, which is going to be the outermost portion of the cerebrum. That is where, from what we know, that's where thinking happens. That's our cortex is very, very well developed compared to other mammals. The white matter is going to be the myelinated fibers traveling down to the body and back up. The major functions of the cerebrum are motor, is going to send our motor information to our muscles. That's going to allow us to move. There's a sensory area, which allows us to interpret information from the sensory receptors. And then finally, the association area is not motor or sensory. It covers a lot of different jobs, and the association area here for the cerebrum, depending on the lobe, it's going to have a different job. So let's go through the lobes. I'll talk more about the insula in a little bit. Okay, so the first lobe we're going to talk about is the frontal lobe. And the frontal lobe is everything anterior to what is called the central sulcus, which is this blue line right here. So the frontal lobe is up here. The frontal lobe is responsible for, first off, thinking. That's going to be the part of your brain which is responsible for problem solving, planning, logic, that the things that make us human. Just anterior to that central sulcus, this dark blue area is called the motor cortex, and that is the portion of the brain which controls our voluntary muscles, so movement. And then finally, we have the small area that's only on the left side. This is one of the few areas of the brain that's not symmetrical. On the left side, we have Broca's area, and that's responsible for the muscles involved in speech. So we watched that video of of that young lady who had a stroke, and she suffered from Broca's aphasia. She knew what she wanted to say, but she couldn't physically say it because her Broca's area was not functioning. Okay, the parietal lobe is going to be the portion that is going to be posterior to the central sulcus. So this back lobe right here, that has the somatosensory cortex. So that is the part of the brain which takes in touch sensation from the body. And that is going to be just anterior. So you can see the motor and the sensory are they're right next to each other, and that's for a reason. They communicate with each other. The sensory information is going to elicit a motor response, and those two parts of the brain are very connected to each other in their function. The parietal lobe, this back portion, is responsible for so much, but we're going to focus on the language portion. It's where we interpret and understand speech and words, what they mean. Language is a huge part of our society. It's what allows us to communicate to the level that we do. It allows us to develop our technologies the way we do. So it makes sense that a huge portion of our brain is devoted to language. It's really one of the things that separates us from other animals. And the parietal lobe has a big part to do with that. This is just an image that shows you the somatosensory and the motor cortex. You're not responsible for this. I just thought it was interesting. Again, this is just the association areas. Again, not responsible for this. I just thought it was interesting. Occipital lobe is going to be the most posterior portion of the brain. That is responsible for visual. So that's going to be interpreting visual information. And then the temporal lobe is going to be on the side here. There's going to be the lateral portion of the brain. And that is going to be auditory. And that is where we're going to have sound memory, so auditory interpretation. And that is also where we have another special area called Wernicke's area. And that's located, again, just on the left side. And that is responsible for analyzing words, so meaning to words. So somebody who has a damage to this area, they can speak, the words come out as if they were saying what they want to say, but they're the wrong words. And it's still pretty misunderstood. It's called fluent aphasia as well. And that was that older gentleman that we watched the video where he was speaking as if he was having a conversation with somebody, but the words were really nonsensical. And then finally, the insula is going to be found just deep in this area right here where the temporal, parietal, and frontal lobe come together. And from what we understand about the insula is that is the portion of the brain which is responsible for self-awareness. It's when you feel hungry, that's the part of your brain that allows you to recognize that you feel hungry. That hunger feeling gets interpreted by this part of the brain, and then you're able to go and find some food. Okay, this was just an activity we did, right versus left brain. Again, interesting, not responsible for it. Okay, let's get back into some structures. So the basal ganglia is a portion of the brain that, from what we know right now, it's really, think of it as the editor of your movements. There's so much information being passed from your brain to your spinal cord, to your muscles. And when you pick something up, put something down, wave hi to a friend, do whatever, any movement that you make, there's a lot of information getting passed back and forth. And in order for that to happen in a smooth and executed manner, your basal ganglia is kind of like the editor of those movements. It inhibits excess brain activity going from your motor cortex to your muscles, and it allows you to pick something up and put it down the way you're supposed to. Now, they've linked this, and they found that basal ganglia is really connected to the neurotransmitter called dopamine, which is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. And in patients that have Parkinson's, they have a lack of dopamine, and that leads to these movements that are not well executed. You get jumpy movements, tremors, things where the muscles are not being held in check by the basal ganglia. Diencephalon has a lot going on. The diencephalon is the center of the brain. Couple parts of it that we're going to focus on. The thalamus, which is this central portion here, and the thalamus is really like the phone operator of the brain. As sensory information comes in, it sends that information to the proper area to get interpreted. So, for example, you hear a loud noise, is it a gunshot? Is it a car backfiring? Is it someone clapping? Your brain has to sort that out, and your thalamus is responsible for sending it to the right place to get that information interpreted correctly. The hypothalamus really has nothing to do with the thalamus other than the fact that it's below it. That's why it's called the hypothalamus. It sits right here, just below the thalamus, and that is responsible for your homeostatic processes. It controls your hunger, your sleep cycles, your growth. That's what triggers your growth spurt when you turned 13 or however old you were when you grew an inch or two. So that's all controlled by your hypothalamus. The limbic system is what's considered your emotional portion of your brain. It's what triggers emotional responses. And again, we're not talking about, why am I sad? We're talking about a actual quick emotional feeling of sad, happy, angry, fear. There's those 7 emotions that are exhibited by the human brain, and those are really there for survival. So emotional, the limbic system is there to allow you to survive. A couple parts that you're responsible for. You need to know about the fact that there is, actually, sorry, this is new information. I'm going to hold off there. So I'm going to end this video here. This was just a quick review of what we've gone up to this point. I'm going to pick up with the limbic system in the next video. All right, thanks guys. Have a good day.